think the failure of Copenhagen to result in a binding international treaty on climate was probably more or less a foregone conclusion, given the reality of our modern economy and modern politics. The reality is that we're hooked on growth. Economic growth is the metric that we use for nations, economies, to reveal the health of our system. You know? So if we don't have economic growth, there's a problem. And politicians are committed to producing economic growth. If a politician is not committed to producing economic growth, that politician does not advance, doesn't get to a very high level, gets sidelined very quickly. So the only politicians we have are ones who are promising economic growth, and if they don't deliver, they don't stay in office very long. Well, economic growth and climate change, contrary to what some people say, are almost mutually exclusive problems in terms of, solving climate change is going to require us to step off the accelerator of economic growth. There's just no getting around that. Dealing with climate change means burning dramatically less fossil fuels. And fossil fuels are what have given us economic growth over the past 150 years. So getting off of fossil fuels is going to require us to make some fundamental economic changes that a lot of politicians are going to have a lot of real trouble with. And that's not just in the US. It's just as true in China or India or Russia or you name it. Now, some countries, the smaller island countries that are not big fossil fuel producers that import fossil fuels, countries like that don't have so much to worry about if the world is getting off of fossil fuels. It's not going to disrupt their economies nearly as much as climate change itself will. So those are the countries that are calling for really strenuous efforts. But then you look at countries like the United States, China, Canada, India. These are the countries that are the major carbon emitters, and their economies are all depending on growth, all depending on fossil fuels, all depending on coal. So for these countries, it's really difficult. And politicians want to satisfy everyone. They want to say the right things. They want to be seen as being green and responsible and so on. But the reality of the situation is, if they were to really deliver on those kinds of promises, they wouldn't be able to deliver on the promise that really matters, that's the bottom line of everything, and that's robust economic growth.
So it's not capitalism or communism or any other ism. It's a structural problem in the whole global system?
I think it's a structural problem in the global economy, and it could be argued that economic growth is more a characteristic of capitalist economies. The need for economic growth, I should say, is more tied to capitalist economies than other kinds. But the reality is that's whether you call it capitalism or a mixed economy or whatever, that's what we have in the world today. I mean, some countries may be somewhat more socialist in character. You've got China's economy, which is this strange kind of mixture of communism and capitalism and totalitarian, capitalism. You could come up with all kinds of different names, but growth is what everybody. If your country isn't growing its economy, that means it's going to lose out to some other country. Whether country A calls itself communist or capitalist or whatever, it doesn't matter. If it's not producing economic growth, it's going to lose out in the game. So, and nobody wants to do that.
So, there's been a huge focus on just on the climate change and energy issue.
Right.
But I heard nobody at the place in Bella Center in the official halls, as opposed to the parallel conference, talking about peak oil, water issues, uranium mining, a whole host of other things, fishing, overfishing. Can we solve all these other problems just by getting a binding agreement on climate change? I mean, does it make sense not to consider it as a basket of issues?
Well, if we got a really strong global climate policy, it would help with a lot of other issues. It would help with a lot of problems with the oceans, and it would help with biodiversity problems. It would help with certainly the peak oil, fossil fuel limits, because if we're voluntarily reducing our reliance on fossil fuels, then that could reduce the impact of scarcity as that comes upon us. But it's not going to solve everything. I mean, the human condition in the early 21st century is one of species overshoot. We have too many people chasing depleting resources and emitting all kinds, not just carbon dioxide, but all kinds of industrial pollutants into the atmosphere and rivers and oceans and everything else. And the result of that is a rate of biodiversity loss that's something like 1,000 times the background rate of extinctions. It's not just 50% more or twice as much or 3 times, 1,000 times the background rate of extinctions. So solving climate change is going to help with some of these other problems, but it's not going to solve them. Another one is loss of topsoil. We're losing 25 billion tons of topsoil every year. The only thing that's going to change that is radical reforming of our whole food system, our agriculture system. It means not just farming differently, it also means farming different things, eating different kinds of food, developing perennial grain crops, so that we're not disturbing topsoil as we're growing this enormous amount of food that we need in order to feed 7 billion people. Now, the human mind has evolved to kind of focus on one problem at a time, and it's understandable that world leaders, in looking at climate change, have really focused on it as a unique and bounded issue. And these days, when you get a room full of environmentalists and policymakers together, every other sentence is about greenhouse gas emissions and emissions caps and the language of climate change. And that language doesn't capture all of these other issues with freshwater scarcity and things we've been talking about. And that's a problem. We can't afford to ignore those things, because the reality is our world and the future of humanity are at stake, not just because of climate change, but because of each of these issues. There are probably 5 issues that I would call potentially game-ending issues, not just game-changing, game-ending. And certainly climate change is one of them, but topsoil loss, loss of fresh water, loss of biodiversity, the potential death of the oceans, and short-term problems like peak oil and global economic collapse. These are all potentially game-ending issues, and unless we deal with each and every one of them, we're in for some very, very difficult times.
Well, there's the old saw that you can't expect the people that cause the problem to solve the problem with the same kind of thinking. And you could apply it to California, or you could apply it to, the system that didn't foresee and forestall the onset of the crisis.
Right.
Probably has no capacity to solve it. So are we up the proverbial creek, or what do you see the options are?
After Copenhagen, I personally have come to some conclusions about where I want to put my energies as time goes on. Copenhagen was all about achieving a global solution to a global problem. And I think the failure of Copenhagen has probably awakened a lot of folks, certainly has in my case, to the reality that our global political and economic systems are just not capable of dealing with a problem like this. So where does that leave us? Does that leave us with no solution? Well, not necessarily. I mean, we need those kinds of global policies, but we're not going to get them. Nevertheless, if you start looking around for solutions, for things that people are actually doing that could make a difference, almost all of those solutions are happening at a local level on a fairly small scale. Is that enough? Probably not. But at least there is some traction happening. I'm talking about the transition initiatives, transition towns, thousands of projects all over the world for water conservation and for protecting biodiversity and for developing sustainable food systems, and on and on and on. And we could talk for hours about the wonderful work that's being done along these lines. I think really that's where we have to put our effort. I don't want to discourage anyone from activism at the global or national level, because who knows, maybe there could be a breakthrough on one hand, and on the other hand, if we take our eye off that ball, if good people stop paying attention to what's going on at the national and global level, we could get world leaders who are not just incompetent and corrupt as like the ones we have now, but we could get world leaders who are just absolutely evil and intent on taking the whole world in an even worse direction. So, we have to pay attention, we have to stay involved, but I really think that whatever solutions we're going to get, whatever productive responses we're going to get, are going to come primarily at the local level.
What do you make of the point of view vis-a-vis Copenhagen, that if a legally binding multilateral agreement had been reached, that was basically negotiated by backroom deals made by lobbyists and industry, bad guys, it would have cut every progressive cause you want to mention kind of off at the knees.
Right.
So in that sense, maybe it was a good thing that they didn't manage to cope.
Yeah.
What do you think?
This is what Jim Hansen, the famous NASA climate scientist, says. He didn't go to Copenhagen, and he actually made the comment that he hoped that an agreement wouldn't come out of Copenhagen because he thought it would actually be worse than no agreement at all, given the circumstances. And I actually think he's right. That there's a danger that we could get national and global policies that would, in effect, monopolize all efforts to deal with climate and other similar kinds of problems. So that you couldn't do, if you were a town or a city or a nonprofit organization, you couldn't do more than a certain level of good in terms of reducing carbon emissions and taking carbon out of the atmosphere, or whatever we need to do to mitigate climate change, because there would be this cap and a trading mechanism that would, in effect, if you do some good over here, well, it's just going to be spread out to other folks who want to pollute more. And so from that standpoint, maybe it's better not to have a corrupting national or global deal until we can come up with a better way of solving this. Hansen is in favor of carbon tax, and then just taking the proceeds of the carbon tax and giving it out to the people. That's the simplest thing, and I think is probably would be a lot better than trading permits and coming up with carbon offsets and all of this very complicated stuff that would enrich a lot of derivatives traders, but probably not result in very much improvement in the climate situation.
So do you agree that a carbon tax would be the best approach?
We need to make fossil fuels more expensive so that other forms of energy are cheaper by comparison. We need to make solar and wind and geothermal and all the rest look better by comparison to fossil fuels. And you do that by making fossil fuels more expensive. But there's an economic pain attached to that because there are millions and billions of people whose lives depend on being able to commute to work and do all the other things that fossil fuels enable us to do. So if you're taxing everybody in their use of fossil fuels, raising their cost of living, it's pretty hard to get their buy-in to that. It makes life difficult. So if you take the proceeds from the carbon tax and then distribute it to folks so that they can make their own economic decisions and choose the options that make sense for them, which will in every case be energy conservation and alternative energy sources, then it all makes sense. It all kind of works. You're using a market mechanism to achieve the public good, but in a way that doesn't enrich folks who are basically just parasites on society, the derivatives traders and folks like that.
So any final wisdoms, aside from what gives you hope kinds of things? I mean, what keeps you going, I think, is more
what keeps me going?
Knowing that hope came out of Pandora's box last.
Right. I have to go back to the local efforts, really. There's the famous old saying, power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely. As you go up this pyramid of power in human society, and we've created an enormous pyramid of power over the past 100 years or so, where the people at the top of this pyramid, and most of them we don't even know their names, multi-billionaires who prefer to operate behind the scenes and have enormous influence over political decisions and so on. Trying to influence what's going on in the world by getting those folks at the top of the pyramid to act against their personal economic interests, very difficult. So I think what we have to do is mobilize folks at the lower end of that pyramid, and that means getting more and more folks involved in projects that are actually very exciting and interesting and fun, like the transition initiatives. And the more we can do that, the more we will be able to just change the whole nature of this process. As the global economy comes unglued, as the world continues into this economic depression that we see, it's really changing the whole narrative that we've been living with. Everybody wants economic growth to continue, but the fact is it's not. We're entering a new world, a new state of being on this planet for humanity, and that's the post-growth economy. Rules are going to be very different, both politically and economically, and I think the folks who are working at the local level to develop resilient, robust, sustainable local economies are at the crest of that wave, and they're going to find themselves, I think, in positions of increasing influence.